The intercom crackled at 0730 hours. Rodriguez. Pediatric wing. Room for 12. Just a name. No urgency. No context. Katie pulled her badge from the locker, the metal dog tag beneath her scrub shifting against her collarbone, cold, familiar, a weight she'd carried for 3 years like a secret heartbeat. 8 months at Sacred Heart, and nobody knew her. 8 months of making beds, checking vitals, disappearing into supply closets when voices got too loud. 8 months of being the quiet one, the new girl, the nurse who kept her head down and her mouth closed. The pediatric wing smelled like antiseptic and something else, the particular stillness of a room where hope had already left. Katie pushed the cart down the hallway, fluorescent lights casting shadows across her forearms, across the thin white scars that told stories she would never tell. Room for 12 was at the end of the corridor, door half open, afternoon light cutting across linoleum tile. He was small. 10 years old, maybe. Dark hair, olive skin, eyes that didn't track movement. The chart clipped to the foot of his bed read, Michael Carson. Ramadi. Shrapnel. Blindness. Bilateral optic nerve damage. Irreversible. The word irreversible had been underlined 3 times. Katie pulled the chair beside his bed and sat with the quietness of someone trained to move without being heard. Hi, Michael. I'm Katie. I'm going to help take care of you while you're here. Her voice came out soft, careful, exactly as it always did. Is it okay if I check your bandages? He didn't answer. Just lay there, still as stone. The door opened. Heavy footsteps. Military cadence, 1-2, 1-2, like boots on a flight deck. Katie's shoulders tense before she turned. Colonel James Carson stood in the doorway wearing an Air Force dress uniform, the blue fabric sharp as a blade, his face carved from exhaustion and something harder underneath. Captain's bars on his collar. No, not captain. Colonel. Full bird colonel. Katie's hand steadied on the chart even as her chest tightened into a fist. She'd last seen that face 3 years ago in a court-martial hearing. In a room where 12 officers sat in judgment. Where he'd read her charges aloud with the mechanical precision of a man delivering a death sentence. Disobeying direct orders during a classified medevac operation in Ramadi. Refusing to leave 3 wounded Marines behind. Flying into a hot landing zone when the mission was declared compromised. When the order came down, extract the priority asset and leave the others. Katie had extracted all of them. The court-martial lasted for hours. The silence lasted longer. She turned back to Michael's chart, her hands moving with the efficiency of someone who had learned to exist without being seen. The colonel settled into the visitor's chair, the expensive one, the one with actual cushioning, and Katie felt his attention on her the way she might feel a laser sight on her back. But his eyes were empty. Hollow. He was looking through her, not at her, the way you look at a nurse when you're really only seeing your child. He didn't recognize her. Of course he didn't. Katie Rodriguez, the new girl, bore no resemblance to Major Catherine Rodriguez, 160th SAW Night Stalkers, who'd had surgical hands and a call sign and clearance signatures from generals. That person had been erased. Officially dead. Medically retired, classified out, pension rerouted to a black account, name removed from the roster. The Pentagon preferred its embarrassments quiet. How long has he been without sight? She asked. 10 words. No more. No less. 2 months. The colonel's voice moved like a tank idling in a garage, steady, powerful, carrying weight. Surgeons at Walter Reed. Johns Hopkins. Mayo Clinic. They ran every test. Optical coherence tomography. Visual evoked potentials. MRI with contrast. All of it. He paused, and Katie heard in that pause the sound of a man whose authority meant nothing against biology, against shrapnel, against the random mathematics of trauma. 10 doctors. 10 different opinions. All the same conclusion. Katie opened Michael's chart completely. 8 pages. Referrals from Johns Hopkins. From Walter Reed Medical Center. From Mayo Clinic. She ran her fingers down the diagnostic summaries, her eyes catching on phrases: extensive axonal damage, retinal detachment secondary to trauma, irreversible optic nerve atrophy, recommend counseling and adaptive resources. Permanent darkness. 10 doctors had voted on it with their signatures and their certainty. Katie set the chart down and moved toward Michael's bed. She moved like someone trained in field medicine, in working with patients who couldn't move, who couldn't respond, who were fragments of themselves stitched back into something that looked like human shape. She raised his left eyelid gently with her thumb. The pupil was dilated, fixed, the kind of pupil that told a story of nerves severed, signals interrupted, light entering but carrying no message to the brain. But there. A micro-movement. Just barely perceptible. The pupil's edge trembled for 1/100th of a second as her penlight found it. Katie's breath stayed level. Her hand didn't shake. But something in her central nervous system registered the tremor the way a seismograph registers an earthquake before anyone else feels it. She checked the other pupil. Same pattern. Same micro-movement in response to light stimulus. Pupillary response suggested nerve preservation. Preservation suggested potential. He's going to be fine, the colonel said behind her, and the flatness in his voice told Katie this was a lie he'd learned to live with. The military has good resources for adaptive training. Service dogs. Vocational rehabilitation. He'll learn to navigate. Better kids have done it. Katie didn't turn around. She documented what she'd seen in Michael's chart in the precise, careful handwriting of a woman who'd written field reports that changed tactical operations. 2 words, micro-tremor noted. I should go, the colonel said. He stood with the sound of a man who'd been trained to make movement decisive. I have a briefing. I'll be back at 1900 hours. Katie didn't watch him leave. She finished her assessment of Michael, explained everything she was doing in the soft voice that had become her uniform, her camouflage, the way she disappeared into hospital beige. When she was finished, she stood and excused herself from the room. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was empty, which was what made it useful. Katie slipped inside and pulled the door closed, the darkness immediate and complete. She reached beneath her scrubs and found the broken chain, the metal dog tag cold against her fingers. She didn't look at it. She never looked at it. She just held it for a moment, 7 seconds, 8, and let it tell her who she wasn't anymore. Major Catherine Rodriguez. Combat Rescue. 3 tours. Silver Star. That person was gone. Erased by an order she couldn't follow, court-martialed by a colonel she couldn't refuse, disappeared by a Pentagon that couldn't tolerate the fact that she'd chosen Marines over mission parameters. And now his son was blind. 10 doctors had decided his fate. 10. The number repeated in her head like a ticking clock. 10. 10. 10. Katie released the chain and let it fall back beneath her scrubs. She pressed her back against the cold metal shelving and let her breathing return to normal. In through her nose. Hold. Out through her mouth. The technique they'd taught her in flight training, in SEER school, in the year they spent preparing her to operate in places where the ground wanted you dead. The door to the supply closet opened without warning. Dr. Ashford stood silhouetted against the hallway fluorescence, his presence making the air pressure change, the way a storm front moves in and everything living can feel it coming. 43, maybe. Chief of Neurology. Polished shoes. Polished everything. The kind of man who'd ascended through competence and the particular talent for making sure no one around him ever got credit for anything. Rodriguez. Not a question. I'm reviewing the new admission. 10-year-old male, bilateral optic nerve damage, status post-shrapnel injury. 10 consulting physicians. All the same diagnosis. He stepped inside the closet and Katie stood without moving, without any of the flinching that was bubbling beneath her ribs like pressure in a sealed compartment. I see you added a note. Micro-tremor noted. What exactly does that mean? Katie's voice came out level. Possible nerve preservation. The 10 physicians who've already examined him would disagree. Dr. Ashford's smile moved across his face like a weapon being unsheathed. Are you suggesting those 10 doctors missed something? I'm suggesting the pupils responded. The pupils of dying nerves can twitch for weeks post-trauma. It's sympathetic response, not functional preservation. Meaningless. He paused, and in that pause Katie understood that Dr. Ashford had just decided something about her. I'll be overseeing this patient's care. You'll continue standard observation. Nothing more. Are we clear? Yes, doctor. Good. Get back to work. He left. The door swung closed. Katie stood in the darkness of the supply closet for another 10 seconds, her hand steady at her sides, her breathing unchanged, her composure intact. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the particular stillness of someone trained to absorb impact without breaking. That evening, Katie drove home through Jacksonville rain, past the cemetery where her husband wasn't buried because his body had never been found. Past the 24-hour diner where she bought coffee at 2,300 hours because sleep required dreams and dreams required memories she'd spent 3 years learning to compartmentalize. Her apartment was small. 1 bedroom. 1 window facing the parking lot. She sat on the edge of her bed and pulled the dog tag from beneath her scrubs. The chain was broken. It had been broken for 3 years, the day she'd removed it, the day they'd erased her, the day she'd understood that the military had decided her actions were more dangerous than any enemy combatant. The dog tag was tarnished now. Worn smooth from 3 years of her holding it in this exact way, alone, in the dark. Catherine Elena Rodriguez. Blood type O negative. Service number 47-291-5847. Rank, Major. Branch, United States Air Force. That woman had extracted 3 Marines from a hot landing zone in Ramadi despite direct orders to leave them. That woman had performed an improvised chest seal on a lance corporal using an MRE plastic wrapper and medical tape because the medical kit had been compromised and the lance corporal's lung was collapsing and she had for minutes before he coded. That woman didn't exist anymore. But she existed in 10 years of medicine, in the hands that had learned to move with surgical precision, in the ability to recognize what 10 other doctors had missed because she'd spent 3 years learning how to see what was invisible to everyone else. The dog tag caught the light from the window. Katie held it there, suspended, and whispered the words she hadn't said aloud since the hearing, "I'm not done yet." Dr. Ashford noticed the questions first. Not in a way that bothered him, but in a way that irritated him the way an insect irritates skin before you flatten it. Morning rounds on the pediatric floor, the fluorescent lights humming their endless song, and Katie Rodriguez stood at Michael Carson's bedside with her tablet held at chest level, asking about alternative diagnostic protocols for partial optic nerve trauma. Not asking. Stating them as questions. The pupillary response shows micro-movements, she said quietly, her voice pitched low so only Ashford and the attending resident could hear. Has anyone considered that the damage might be partial rather than complete? Ashford didn't pause his rounds. He didn't even look at her. He simply kept moving down the hallway, his white coat trailing behind him like a cape, and somewhere in his chest, a small and ancient timer started ticking. He'd been chief of neurology for 17 years. He'd published papers in the New England Journal of Medicine. He'd been quoted by name in hospital marketing materials. And now this nurse, this quiet, competent, 8 months tenure nurse, was suggesting that 10 different specialists, including 2 from Mayo Clinic, had somehow missed something she'd noticed on a single overnight observation. The next morning, Katie stood at the nurse's station reviewing post-op charts when the overhead speaker crackled to life. Her hand froze mid-page. The static lasted 3 seconds. Then, will the new girl Rodriguez please report to the chief's office? The new girl Rodriguez. Immediately. 20 staff members looked up simultaneously. Some pretended they hadn't. Some didn't bother pretending. Katie's badge caught the fluorescent light as she breathed in slowly, deliberately, the way she'd been taught to breathe in a hyperbaric chamber during decompression training, oxygen ratios, pressure, control. She took one measured breath, let a single tear escape which she wiped away without breaking eye contact with the intercom speaker mounted above the supply cabinet, and continued her charting for exactly 5 more seconds before setting down her pen. She walked the corridors with her shoulders level. Her scrubs didn't rustle. Her shoes made no sound on the tile floor. She'd learned that trick in Ramadi, where sound meant targeting, where the loudest person was often the first person on a stretcher. The chief's office smelled like aged leather furniture and the kind of cologne that cost more than her monthly rent. Ashford was waiting. Of course he was waiting. This had been choreographed. "Sit," he said. Katie Saturday. She didn't ask permission, didn't soften her posture, didn't do any of the performative submission that women had been trained to offer since childhood. She simply sat and waited for him to speak, because that was the correct tactical response. Make him fill the silence. "You've been here 8 months, Ashford began, his voice carrying the specific cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "And in that 8 months, you've become quite curious about diagnostic protocols above your pay grade." "I'm doing my job," Katie said. "Observing the patient." "You're doing more than that." He stood, which was a tactical mistake on his part. It meant he felt threatened. "You're questioning the consensus of 10 board-certified neurologists. You're writing notes in the chart that cast doubt on established diagnoses. You're being, quite frankly, insubordinate." The word hung in the air like gunpowder before the match. Insubordinate. Katie had heard that word before, in a military courtroom, spoken by a colonel who didn't know he was condemning someone for trying to save lives. She let the silence grow for exactly 2 seconds. "I'm documenting clinical observations," she said quietly. "That's not insubordination. That's nursing." Ashford's jaw tightened. "Let me be clear. Your questions about alternative treatments, your chart notes, your general attitude that you know better than physicians, it stops today. Immediately. Or I will personally ensure that your performance review reflects someone who doesn't understand her place in the hospital hierarchy. Do you understand me?" Katie absorbed each word with measured breathing, the way she'd absorbed fire from an RPG that missed her Black Hawk by 6 feet. She understood the threat. More importantly, she understood that he was trying to use professional consequences to accomplish what bullying alone hadn't achieved. She understood that he felt genuinely threatened by her observations because his reputation was built on consensus, and consensus was starting to crack. "I understand my place perfectly, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, clinical, the voice of someone reporting damage assessment after a landing. "I'm wondering if you understand yours." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Ashford's face flushed the color of a cardiac arrest monitor, and Katie stood, thanked him, and walked out before he could speak. She moved through the corridors with the same measured pace she'd used on the way in, her heart rate exactly where it needed to be, which was not elevated, was not shaking, was not performing fear for an audience. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 days later, end of shift in the hospital parking lot, the sun already bleeding into the western horizon and the asphalt still hot enough to shimmer, Dr. Ashford made his announcement. Katie had just clocked out, had taken exactly 3 steps toward her car, when his voice cut through the evening air like a scalpel through tissue. "Rodriguez," he called. Loud enough for the entire parking lot rotation to hear. Loud enough for the orderlies loading the ambulance to turn and look. Loud enough for the weight to land exactly where he'd intended. She turned. Her colleagues continued walking, eyes straight ahead, the way people move when witnessing something that might contagion them if they looked too closely. "You're being reassigned to night shift, effective immediately," Ashford announced, his hands clasped in front of him in a posture of absolute authority. "Consider it an opportunity to learn when to speak and when to listen. Night shift starts tomorrow at 1900 hours. Her colleagues stared at the pavement. The orderlies pretended to be very interested in the rear bumper of the ambulance. Katie stood in the center of a parking lot in Jacksonville, Florida, in a hospital where 10 doctors had given up on a child's eyesight, and felt the weight of professional destruction settle across her shoulders like a ballistic vest. She took one measured breath. She let a single tear escape, which she wiped away without breaking eye contact with the man who'd just dismantled her daytime access to the only patient she'd ever truly needed to save. And then she spoke in a voice that was quiet enough that only Ashford heard it, quiet enough that he had to lean forward slightly to catch the words. "I've survived worse men than you, Doctor," she said. "Significantly worse." Then Katie Rodriguez walked to her car with her head high. She didn't hurry. She didn't shuffle. She moved with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the absolute worst, from having held a dying friend in a desert and been told it was insubordination. From having saved 3 Marines and watched her career be erased for it. From having learned that the only thing worse than an enemy is an institution, and institutions move much more slowly than bullets. She drove home through the Jacksonville evening, past the medical district and into the neighborhoods where teachers lived, where middle management lived, where people with secrets lived. Her apartment was small and spare, the way apartments become when you stop unpacking boxes because you're never sure how long you'll stay in a place. She unlocked the door, moved to her nightstand, and pulled open the bottom drawer beneath the quilt she never used. The dog tag was still there. Single, on a broken chain, hanging from her fingers like the last proof of a life that had been classified and buried and officially declared non-existent. She ran her thumb across the embossed text, Catherine Elena Rodriguez. Major. Air Force. Serial number that meant nothing to anyone anymore, identification that had been ceremonially revoked 3 years ago in a courtroom where the truth was considered politically inconvenient. She held it there, suspended between her fingers and the darkness, and whispered words she hadn't said aloud since that hearing, "I'm not done yet." But she wasn't finished. Not even close. Because Katie had spent 18 months studying what 10 different doctors had documented about Michael Carson's condition, and she'd seen something in the pupillary response that they'd all missed. Partial preservation. Recoverable function. The possibility that a child didn't have to live in darkness just because the consensus said he should. And tomorrow night, on the shift where Ashford had exiled her, she would finally have the access she needed to prove it. The third night shift came at 0230 hours. Katie stood in Michael Carson's darkened room, penlight in hand, and watched what 10 doctors had called impossible. The boy's pupils contracted. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. But there. She steadied her breath and repeated the test. Left pupil. Right pupil. The response came again, micro-movement suggesting the optic nerve wasn't dead, just damaged. Dormant. Waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. She'd spent 18 years learning to read the body's whispers. Field hospitals taught that language. The faintest tremor in a pulse could mean internal bleeding 3 inches beneath the skin. A barely perceptible pupillary response could mean the difference between sight and darkness for a child who'd already lost everything else. Michael didn't wake as she tested his accommodation reflex. Her penlight traced a slow arc from his peripheral vision inward, watching his eyes track the beam with movement so small that someone glancing casually would miss them entirely. But Katie wasn't glancing. She was reading him the way she'd read wounded Marines in Ramadi, understanding what their bodies were trying to communicate beneath the damage and debris. The darkness of the room felt like silence after an explosion. That specific silence where you can still hear the ringing in your ears, where the world seems to pause and hold its breath. Katie worked methodically, documenting each response in the small notebook she carried in her scrub pocket. Numbers. Measurements. Objective data that couldn't be dismissed as nursing intuition or overreach. She tested accommodation and convergence. The boy's eyes moved. Not with full strength. Not with the precision of normal vision. But they moved with purpose, with neurological function that contradicted every assessment in his chart. 10 consulting neurologists had written the same conclusion: irreversible optic nerve damage, prognosis hopeless, accept blindness as permanent. 10 highly credentialed men had looked at imaging and declared the case closed. They hadn't stood at the bedside in the dark. They hadn't watched a child's pupils respond to light. They hadn't listened to what the body was actually saying instead of what the scan seemed to confirm. Katie's hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who'd kept people alive when the alternative was immediate death. She performed a full cranial nerve assessment, each test precise, each observation documented. Michael's eyes showed preservation of the oculomotor nerve. The facial nerve had intact function. The glossopharyngeal reflex remained intact. The vagus nerve responded. All of it contradicting the narrative of total irreversible damage. She was 3 hours into the shift when Michael's body went rigid. The seizure came without warning, no aura, no prodromal signs. His back arched. His eyes rolled back. His limbs contracted with the jerking, violent precision of neuronal misfiring. Katie moved before thought registered. She was already reaching for the call button with one hand while positioning him on his side with the other, muscle memory from 1,000 field emergencies taking over her deliberate movements. Code blue. Pediatric seizure. Room for 12, she called out, though she was already assessing. Not hypoglycemia. His skin was warm. Not fever. His breathing remained intact. Not aspiration, he hadn't eaten. The medication interaction. She'd seen it before in Ramadi when a young corporal's antibiotics conflicted with his antimalarial regimen, sent him into convulsions that nearly killed him before the field hospital neurologist recognized what had happened. Michael's chart. She knew it by heart. The seizure medication interaction between his new phenytoin dosing and the macrolide antibiotic they'd started yesterday for his respiratory infection. The pharmacy had missed it. The attending had missed it. The interaction was obscure enough that it required someone familiar with field medicine's narrow margins between life and death to recognize the pattern. The seizure lasted 42 seconds. Too long. Dangerous. Katie was already moving toward the crash cart, toward the emergency intubation kit, when his body began to relax. But the relaxation meant nothing if he seized again. Aspiration risk. Hypoxia risk. She grabbed the laryngoscope with the decisiveness of someone who'd performed emergency airways in moving helicopters with artillery rounds incoming. I'm going to need a size 4.0 pediatric endotracheal tube and 1 mg epinephrine drawn up, she said to the resident who'd finally arrived, breathless and uncertain in the doorway. Not a question. Not a request. The voice of someone who'd made these decisions when the alternative was letting someone die on the tarmac. He needs neurology. I need to call Dr. Ashford, the resident stammered. He needs oxygen, Katie replied. Ashford can wait 3 minutes. She positioned Michael's head with the precision of a surgeon. The penlight revealed the anatomy she needed, the epiglottis, the vocal cords, the space between them no larger than her pinky fingernail. The laryngoscope blade slid in with practiced smoothness. She'd done this on wounded 18-year-olds bleeding out from thoracic trauma. She'd done this on Marines whose faces were burned beyond recognition. She'd done this on the broken bodies of people who were counting on her steady hands and clear mind. The endotracheal tube slid through the vocal cords with the gentle resistance of proper placement. She secured it with swift tape, already reaching for the bag valve mask. Oxygen flowed into Michael's lungs. 60%. 70. 80. His O2 saturation climbed from the dangerous low 80s into the low 90s. The color returned to his lips. The room went dead silent. 2 nurses stood frozen. The resident's hands trembled. Katie didn't pause. She'd already drawn up the second dose of seizure medication, already documented the time of intubation, already begun the charting that would either protect Michael or destroy her career. She knew which one was more likely. She documented everything. The time of seizure onset. The seizure duration. The respiratory status pre-intubation. The medication interaction between phenytoin and azithromycin. The intubation procedure itself, performed as an emergency medical intervention to protect the airway, performed by a nurse with the skills to do it because in a field hospital, the rank on your column meant nothing compared to whether your hands were steady and your mind was clear. But she also documented her earlier findings. The pupillary responses. the accommodation reflex, the convergence movements, the cranial nerve function that contradicted the 10 doctors' consensus. She documented it methodically, scientifically, with the precision of someone who'd learned to build an evidence trail that couldn't be easily dismissed. The pages she filled at night were a map. If someone knew how to read it, the map showed a path toward partial vision restoration. A treatment protocol that might work if started within weeks. A child who didn't have to live in permanent darkness because 10 doctors had looked at the same imaging and decided the case was closed. What they didn't know was that Katie Rodriguez had already buried one impossible outcome. Her husband had bled out on a tarmac despite her steady hands and all her training. She'd learned the hard way that sometimes impossible was just what happened when you didn't fight hard enough or soon enough. She wouldn't bury a second one. Not if she could help it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 0630 when Dr. Ashford arrived to review the charts and saw what she'd documented. His face went very still as he read through the seizure assessment, the intubation procedure, the neurological findings from her midnight evaluation. She watched him understand what she'd done. Documented her diagnostic impressions. Performed a procedure. Questioned the established consensus through the irrefutable language of objective clinical data. She watched him calculate how to respond. And in his eyes, she saw the moment he decided that Katie Rodriguez had finally given him everything he needed to remove her from Michael's care permanently. Dr. Ashford arrived at Sacred Heart 20 minutes after Katie pressed the emergency intubation tube past Michael's vocal cords, his shoes clicking against the hallway tiles with the precision of a man accustomed to rooms parting before him. The pediatric wing fell silent. Nurses straightened. An attending physician stepped back from the monitors without being asked. Katie remained at Michael's bedside, her hand still steady from muscle memory, from field hospitals where hesitation meant body bags. She was adjusting the ventilator settings when Ashford pulled the digital chart from its wall mount and began scrolling through her documentation. His reading lasted for minutes. Katie counted them by the ventilator's breath cycle. In-out. In-out. She watched his face travel through shock, then something far more dangerous, recognition. The pupillary response documentation. The micro-movements logged with timestamps. The medication interaction she'd flagged 3 hours before the seizure occurred. Her clinical notes were precise enough that a first-year resident could follow them. They were also absolutely correct, which meant they proved 10 consulting doctors and 1 chief of neurology had missed what a quiet night shift nurse had seen in a single observation window. Ashford closed the chart. He looked at Katie with the expression of a man who'd just realized the threat wasn't where he thought it was. Then he smiled. It was the kind of smile that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer. "Excellent work tonight, Rodriguez," he said quietly. "The boy was lucky you were here." Katie said nothing. She adjusted the sedation drip another 0.2 milliliters, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Not flinching. Not accepting the compliment as reconciliation. Just work. Within 6 hours, the reassignment paperwork was filed. Not as a punishment that would have left a trail. Instead, it was framed as an opportunity. The emergency department needed experienced nurses. Katie's performance in trauma situations was exemplary. A lateral move, nothing more. Except it removed her from the pediatric wing entirely. Except the timing was surgical. Except Ashford scheduled the transfer to begin immediately, during the night shift, when there were fewer witnesses and no department heads to question the decision. Katie packed her small locker, trauma shears, 3 granola bars, a battered stethoscope that had survived 2 combat zones, and walked to the ER without argument. The mask held. The quiet acceptance. The woman who asked no questions and obeyed protocol without complaint. But that wasn't the worst part. The second strike came through the hospital scheduling system. Ashford had system administrator access through his role as chief of neurology. He used it to rewrite the rotations, to lock Katie's credentials from accessing the pediatric unit's electronic locks. She couldn't enter the wing physically. The system wouldn't allow it. Her badge would simply not work. It was the kind of escalation that looked like a technical glitch, a database error, something that happened. Except it happened at precisely the moment when Michael's treatment window was narrowing, when the nerve preservation she documented was beginning its decline, when every hour mattered more than the one before it. Katie tested her badge against the pediatric lock at 0400 hours. The red light. The soft beep. Access denied. She stood there for 7 seconds, staring at the red indicator as if it might change through sheer force of will. It didn't. By 1000 hours on the same day, Ashford had made his 3 phone calls. Each one strategic. Each one to a hospital board member. Each one carefully worded to sound concerned rather than vengeful. I wanted to bring something to your attention. It's not a formal complaint, but I felt obligated to flag. We need to consider liability. A nurse documenting symptoms outside her scope of practice. The conversation architecture was flawless. He wasn't accusing Katie of anything. He was simply raising reasonable questions about professional boundaries, about who had authority to assess neurological conditions, about the danger of nursing staff overstepping their designated role. The phone calls arrived like dominoes. By 11:30 hours, the Chief of Human Resources requested a meeting. By 11:45 hours, Katie had a written notice of formal investigation. The charges were technical, protocol violation, scope of practice infringement, unauthorized diagnostic assessment, but they were also catastrophic. The paperwork was official. Quiet. Designed to evaporate her from Michael's care before anyone could prove she was right. That evening, Katie sat in her truck in the hospital parking lot and read the investigation notice 4 times, trying to see if there was a window, a crack in the language where the truth might fit. There wasn't. The notice had been drafted with precision. By a lawyer. Probably the hospital's legal team, probably responding to Ashford's phone calls with the kind of protective apparatus they used whenever a staff member became a liability rather than an asset. She drove north toward the cemetery where her husband lay buried. The same cemetery where she'd scattered some of his ashes 8 years ago. The rain began somewhere around Jacksonville's edge, light at first, then heavy enough that the wipers couldn't keep pace. Her headlights cut through gray sheets of water that seemed to fall upward as much as down. The cemetery gates were open at night. Nobody locked them. She parked near the back fence where the oldest graves lay, where the headstones had eroded enough that some names were no longer readable. The rain hammered against her jacket like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. His grave was exactly as she remembered it. The stone read Thomas James Rodriguez, Major, United States Air Force, with his dates and the simple insignia of his rank. She'd had them carved, nothing about him being a hero. Nothing about his service. Nothing except his name and the fact that he'd belonged to something larger than himself. Katie knelt in the mud. The rain soaked through her scrubs immediately. Her knees pressed into earth that had settled over his coffin 8 years ago, that had held his body long enough for the world to forget he'd existed. She reached into the neck of her scrubs and pulled out the broken dog tag chain. The metal had oxidized to a dull gray. The chain was corroded at the break point. She held it in both hands the way a person might hold a prayer they couldn't quite voice. I couldn't save you, she whispered. And now I can't save the son of the man who destroyed me for trying to save others. The rain continued falling. Her voice was steady. Not cracking. Not trembling. Just facts stated to a man who couldn't hear them anymore. She placed the dog tag on his headstone, leaning it against the carved stone so it faced downward. A return. A surrender. A woman handing back the only evidence she'd ever existed as anything other than a quiet nurse who followed protocol. She stood. The mud released her knees with a wet sound like something breaking. She turned toward the cemetery gates, toward the truck, toward whatever came next. Toward walking away from Sacred Heart. Toward letting Michael Carson go back to blindness while his father never learned the reason why. Toward disappearing again, completely this time. That was when she heard it. The distinctive sound that made her body snap into alertness before her mind caught up. Rotors. The deep, rhythmic thud of a helicopter's blades cutting air. The sound grew louder, Closer. Coming toward the cemetery instead of away from it. Katie turned slowly, her hand reflexively moving to where the dog tag used to rest against her chest. Her tactical mind was already running calculations. 2 aircraft by the rotor signature. Military designation. Approach vector suggesting an LZ landing pattern rather than reconnaissance pass. The cemetery's open field lay 50 meters north of her position. Enough space. Enough clearance. She watched the sky, waiting, while the sound became physical, became force, became the presence of something larger than civilian life entering her world. That was when she understood. Someone knew. Someone had told them. The erasure was over. The first Black Hawk broke through the rain like a knife, landing light on the field despite its weight and bulk. Then the second, its rotor wash bending the grass flat in concentric circles. The ground shook. The headstone seemed to vibrate with something between applause and warning. A full bird colonel emerged from the first aircraft before the rotors had fully slowed. He moved with command authority, with the bearing of someone accustomed to runways opening before him. Behind him came 4 men in dress uniforms, medals on their chests catching the grey afternoon light. And 2 more in civilian clothes with the bearing of people who'd spent careers operating in environments where uniforms meant liability. Katie stood absolutely still, rain streaming down her face, her posture unconsciously shifting into parade rest. 8 years of hiding colliding with muscle memory. The colonel turned toward where she stood at the cemetery fence, near her husband's grave, near the broken dog tag she'd just surrendered. He walked toward her through the rain as if it didn't dare touch him. The rotor wash hit her like a physical force. Rain and cemetery grass bent sideways as the Black Hawk descended, its nose angled like a predator. Katie froze for exactly 1 breath, not fear, not shock, but recognition. That sound. Those rotors. 3,847 hours of her life had been defined by that sound. The electromagnetic pulse of it moved through her chest like a second heartbeat coming online. 2 aircraft. Both UH-60M Black Hawks, side numbers painted in matte black. Not a standard transport. This was a direct action insertion, and it was landing in the Jacksonville Municipal Cemetery because of her? The rotor wash flattened the grass completely flat, and Catherine Rodriguez, who had spent 8 years being nobody, watched military personnel rappel down from both aircraft with the choreographed precision of operators who'd done this 1,000 times. Not JSOC. Higher. The bird collar on the lead man as he touched ground was a full bird colonel, and he moved like a man accustomed to being obeyed instantly. She didn't move. Composure held like steel. The colonel's voice came through a tactical radio built into his uniform, magnified and clear, "I need Major Rodriguez. Immediately." He wasn't shouting. That was the terrifying part. He didn't need to shout. Authority that quiet could move mountains. Dr. Ashford stood frozen beside her car, 30 feet back, his surgeon's hands trembling so badly his car keys fell to the asphalt with a sound like a gunshot. He was watching the military machinery descend, watching the perimeter being established, watching the reality of his miscalculation unfold in real time. His phone buzzed. Then again. Then 3 more times in succession. The hospital board calling. The hospital lawyers calling. News outlets calling. The machine he'd thought he controlled was swallowing him. Katie turned to face the colonel as he approached. Rain clung to her uniform, scrub soaked through, her nurse's badge dangling from a frayed lanyard. Her dog tag was no longer around her neck. It lay on her husband's headstone, a sacrifice she'd made 10 minutes ago, a final surrender to the erasure. The colonel stopped 3 feet from her. She could see the tremor in his jaw, the way his hand shook as he opened the folder in his grip. This man had destroyed her career 8 years ago with the same composure, the same certainty. He was not certain now. Major Catherine Rodriguez, he said, and her name in military cadence sounded like resurrection. Air Force Combat Rescue. Silver Star for extracting 12 wounded from a hot landing zone in Ramadi, the same mission where you disobeyed my direct order to abandon 3 Marines I declared unsalvageable. His voice cracked. Actually cracked. The same operation where I court-martialed you for insubordination and had your service record sealed. Classified. Erased. A Navy SEAL commander stepped forward from the perimeter, tall, scarred, moving like coiled rope. She knew him. Lieutenant Mercer. Charlie Platoon. She'd pulled him out of a burning building in 2016. He took the file from the colonel and continued, his voice carrying the gravelly weight of a man who'd seen warfare up close and never quite left it behind. 2 Bronze Stars, Mercer said. Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds sustained during your 3rd extraction. Distinguished Flying Cross for navigating a dust storm with 0 visibility to reach a medevac point 2 miles behind enemy lines. You were court-martialed for saving lives because that mission was politically inconvenient, and when the cover-up went to Pentagon level, they didn't just discharge you. He paused. Let it sit. They erased you. Legally. Completely. Catherine Rodriguez, Major, was removed from the record. All of it. Like you never existed. The rain hammered down harder. Sound like applause on the cemetery markers. Colonel Carson's voice came through the rain like a blade. This morning I discovered the nurse you've been destroying is the reason I still have 3 men alive to serve as godparents to my son. 3 Marines who should be dead. 3 families who exist because she disobeyed me when I was wrong. And she's the only person who noticed what 10 doctors, 10 qualified specialists, missed about Michael's condition. Dr. Ashford took a step forward. His mouth opened. Words attempted to form. Carson didn't even acknowledge him. The colonel pulled a phone from his tactical vest and dialed, his voice steady now, the tremor replaced with something colder. This is Colonel James Carson, direct authorization from the Surgeon General's office. I need immediate confirmation on the professional standing of Major Catherine Rodriguez at Sacred Heart Hospital. Pause. No, I will hold. He covered the phone. She's staying on the line with the board chair. Should be about 90 seconds. Katie heard the other voice through the phone speaker, tinny and panicked. Colonel, we can explain about the investigation, the protocol she violated. She didn't violate any protocols, Carson cut him off. She performed her job at the highest possible standard while being systematically destroyed by a man more interested in protecting his reputation than in saving lives. Here's what's going to happen. Major Rodriguez's hospital privileges are being restored immediately. Full access to all patient files, all departments, unrestricted consultation authority. She's going to oversee Michael Carson's neurological case personally, and if any doctor, any administrator, attempts to interfere, I will have the Pentagon's Office of Medical Integrity on your hospital's campus within 24 hours. The board chair's response came through barely audible, all contrition and immediate compliance. Colonel Carson ended the call. He looked directly at Katie, and something shifted in his expression, not forgiveness, not quite, but the recognition of a man seeing clearly what he'd once refused to see. He extended his hand. Welcome back, Major. Katie reached out and took it. Her grip was steady. Military. She was back. Dr. Ashford stood at the edge of the row to wash out a wind, watching his world collapse in real time. His phone buzzed again. And again. The hospital administrator. The medical board. News outlets. By tomorrow morning, his face would be on every local station. By that evening, it would be national. But he didn't know that yet. Right now he just knew that he'd miscalculated catastrophically, that he'd spent months systematically destroying someone he'd assumed was powerless, and that the person he destroyed had been a decorated combat rescue officer the entire time. Within hours, Katie was back in Michael's room at Sacred Heart, the treatment protocol she'd documented now authorized at the highest levels. Specialized corticosteroids. Targeted nerve stimulation. Modified visual therapy designed specifically for partial optic nerve regeneration. She moved through the procedures with the precision of someone who'd performed field medicine under fire, efficient, decisive, unmarked by doubt. That evening, Dr. Ashford appeared on the local news broadcast looking polished, credible, sympathetic. He spoke about protecting patient safety against dangerous overreach. He mentioned that 10 qualified specialists had thoroughly evaluated Michael's case. He noted that allowing unqualified nurses to make medical decisions on complex pediatric cases was precisely the kind of institutional failure that endangered children. He sounded reasonable. He sounded right. Then the news anchor received a call. "We have a 4-star general on the line," the anchor announced, surprise evident in her voice. "He says he has direct knowledge of this situation." The general's voice came through the studio speakers like thunder. "Dr. Ashford is systematically burying a correct diagnosis made by one of the most decorated combat medics in Air Force history. Major Rodriguez's assessment was accurate. His harassment of her is documented on your hospital's own security footage, which I'm told is being reviewed by state medical licensing boards as we speak." The anchor cut to footage. "Supply closet." Dr. Ashford's voice, overstepping. His hand making threats. "The parking lot." His words to an entire shift, "I'm reassigning you to night rotation. Effective immediately. All of it. Everything." Broadcast to 2.1 million viewers across Florida. The general continued, his voice never wavering, "Those 3 Marines Major Rodriguez saved against orders? They're watching right now with their children. The 12 men from that mission are watching. And we're all wondering what kind of doctor destroys someone for being right." Split screen showed Dr. Ashford's face going ashen in real time. By midnight, his medical license was under formal investigation. His board position suspended. His reputation in ruins. 6 months later, Katie stood in Sacred Heart's hospital garden during her break, watching Michael Carson take his first steps with partial vision restored. Enough to see his father's face. Enough to read large print. Enough to reclaim substantial independence. The treatment protocol Katie had identified was being reviewed for national implementation by the Department of Defense. Colonel Carson approached her on the garden path where she sat watching his son chase a butterfly Michael could actually see. "I destroyed you for saving lives," Carson said quietly, "and you saved my son anyway. I don't know how to." "You made a decision in an impossible situation," Katie interrupted, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "I made a different one. We both have to live with that." She touched the dog tag now clasped around her neck on the repaired chain. No longer hidden. No longer surrendered. Major Catherine Rodriguez, reclaimed. "Your son gets to live with his sight," she said. "That's what matters." Colonel Carson saluted her, a full formal salute, perfect execution. She returned it reflexively, muscle memory overriding 8 years of hiding. As he walked away, she saw Dr. Ashford through the lobby windows checking hospital IDs at the security desk. Night shift. The only position Sacred Heart's administration had offered him after his medical privileges were permanently revoked. He saw her watching and quickly looked away. Michael ran past on the garden path, laughing as he chased that butterfly, his father jogging behind him with his hand reaching out to steady his son if he stumbled. Katie's voice came quiet, almost to herself. "Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns." She touched her dog tag one more time, no longer hiding, and walked back into Sacred Heart Hospital with her head high, Major Catherine Rodriguez finally visible to the world. If you believe in giving people a second chance to prove their true worth, like and subscribe. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real background? What would you have done in Katie's position? And if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by everyone.